It's the 10th of April 1905. We're in a market somewhere in Beijing, the capital of China, under the closing years of the Qing dynasty. A crowd has gathered to watch a scruffy young Mongolian man named Fa Chu Li as he's marched to his place of execution, where he will suffer one of the worst deaths imaginable as he is taken apart inch by agonizing inch in a process known as Lingchi, which translates literally to lingering death, or perhaps more popularly, called death by 1,000 cuts. The man has been accused of murdering his own master, the prince of the Aohan Bana in the south of Chinese-held Inner Mongolia. The story goes that this Mongol guard had taken up arms against the prince after he tried to take advantage of his position and forced himself onto the guard's own wife. Fa Chu Li was acting either to protect his family or exact his revenge. Whatever the circumstances may be, though, the crime itself is utterly shocking. For the Qing administration, it's a clear-cut case of shi jun, the slaying of one's own lord, known more formally to us as regicide. Under the Confucian Code of Ethics, violence against a master, father, or emperor were all considered to be unthinkable acts that disturbed the natural harmony of the universe and invited chaos into the realm. This means that, no matter the details, the crime of regicide falls under something called the 10 Abominations, acts that were considered so evil and unnatural that they affected not just the victims, but nature herself. And in Chinese law, someone found guilty of one of these 10 abominations would be subjected to the worst punishments available and could not be pardoned or excused, even by the emperor himself. For Fa Chu Li, the consequences of murdering a superior were about to become very real. The Mongolian princes demanded that Chu Li be burned alive for his crime. But since the emperor at the time, Daizong of Qing, found this form of torture too barbaric, it was switched out instead for Lingchi. However, Lingchi was considered so cruel and inhumane that it was actually slated to be banned within 2 weeks of Chu Li's death. And so the board had to move quickly to make sure he received this sentence before they missed their chance to inflict the maximum suffering possible. And so Chu Li was sentenced to undergo Lingchi, death by 1,000 cuts, on the 10th of April, 1905. The process began by tying Chu Li to a wooden frame so that his arms are tied behind his back and his naked body is exposed to the crowd and the executioner. Then an extremely sharp scalpel is used to take off chunks of flesh, one slice at a time. First, they would start with the extremities, taking off sections of the thighs, calves, forearms, fingers and biceps, before slowly working their way inwards towards the body, stripping away the intercostal muscles to expose bare ribs, and beginning to amputate entire limbs as the victim slowly fades in and out of consciousness. To quote Sir Henry Norman, who recounts the process of Lingchi in his book The Politics and People of the Far East, the executioner, grasping handfuls from the fleshy parts of the body such as the thighs and breasts, slices them away. The limbs are cut off piecemeal at the wrists and ankles, the elbows and knees, shoulders and hips. Death would be put on hold for as long as possible, and when the executioner sensed that his victim was beginning to expire, the blade was plunged into the chest and through the heart. We don't know how long Chu Li lasted, but it's reasonable to assume that death did not come quickly for him. However, once he finally passed, the ordeal would still continue as he was removed from the stake and the scalpel was swapped out for a sword, which was used to further hack the body until he no longer resembled a person, but instead a pile of constituent parts smited away from one another. We know all of this because it's one of the few public executions involving torture that we have actual real photographs for. Obviously, I can't show you them here because they're way too graphic for YouTube, but they're not hard to find. Be warned though, they're extremely unpleasant and disturbing. Don't go looking for these if you're sensitive. Do yourself a favour and just take my word for it. It's debated who took these photographs in the first place, but it was most likely a French soldier stationed in Beijing during the ordeal. One thing that's not debated, though, is that these photographs shocked the international community, and to an extent, they forever immortalised Lingchi as a barbaric form of torture from the Far East. However, all human civilizations have had their ways of inflicting cruelty on others, and despite the controversy this caused on the international stage, let's not forget that China was already scheduled to do away with this punishment, as we mentioned earlier. So, on the 24th of April 1905, this abolition was made official, and Lingchi was banned as a form of execution. This meant that Fo Chu Li should have been the last ever case of someone being subjected to this end, and although he was the last official case, the horror would continue, with one unconfirmed case involving a soldier in 1907, and some shaky accounts that Lingchi had been performed as late as the 1920s and 30s during China's turbulent unrest. But even if Chu Li was the last, he certainly wasn't the first. Forms of Lingchi had been around in China since the earliest emperors, and some say it was used as early as the 9th century BC, but it wouldn't be codified as a legal punishment until the 7th century AD under the Tang dynasty, and although it was used from time to time then, it would still take a couple more centuries before it started to take centre stage in Chinese crime and punishment, which we'll get into shortly. Part of the reason that the use of Lingchi has its peaks and troughs throughout Chinese history was that it was always seen as an immensely controversial form of punishment. See, to Western observers, it just looks like a very cruel and nasty way to extend someone's suffering for as long as possible. But for Chinese culture, there was an added level of horror that's often lost on us. This is a bit of a simplification, but what Christianity is to Western thought, Confucianism is to Chinese thought, and under Confucian ethics, the integrity of your physical body is a really, really important part of your moral and spiritual existence. To quote Confucius directly, the body, hair, and skin are received from one's parents. One must not injure or wound them. This is the beginning of filial piety. So, by subjecting someone to Lingchi, you're not just subjecting them to immense pain, but you're also turning them into something less than human. You're severing their connection to their ancestors and family by mutilating their body, and you're denying them access to the afterlife as a whole person, because now they're in little chunks. It's not unlike the process of being hanged, drawn and quartered in medieval Europe, where the goal is not just to exert power and inflict physical suffering, but also to punish them in the next life and reduce their memory and legacy to one of degradation, indignity and humiliation. For this reason, several attempts had been made throughout China to try and ban its use. One under the 9th century Emperor Shi Jingtang, although it was later reinstated, and then again in the 12th century when the poet Lu You wrote against Lingchi, and his argument was as follows. When the muscles of the flesh are already taken away, the breath of life is not yet cut off. The liver and heart are still connected. Seeing and hearing still exist. It affects the harmony of nature. It is injurious to a benevolent government and does not befit a generation of wise men. However, try as these individuals might, the practice stuck around, and by the 15th and 16th centuries it became a staple part of law and order within China. But the brutality of its use did vary, and scholars often disagree about just how savage the process actually was for the victim, since there was very little formalised detail on how it should be carried out. How bad it was really did just depend on the time, the place, and the crime. Some legal codes specify there should be 100 cuts before death arrives. Others say it must be 3,000, which seems a little high to me. And then, of course, we have lots of stories of the executioners taking bribes from the family of victims and, in exchange, giving them absolutely monstrous doses of opium or slitting them across the throat or heart first in order to spare the victim unnecessary suffering. A man named George Ernst Morrison was actually able to write down an eyewitness account of Lingchi in the 19th century book An Australian in China, in which he describes Lingchi in a way that is both better and worse than we might think. It's a bit long, but it's worth it. To quote, "The prisoner is tied to a rude cross, invariably deeply under the influence of opium. The executioner, standing before him with a sharp sword, makes 2 quick incisions above the eyebrows and draws down the portion of skin over each eye. Then he makes 2 more quick incisions across the breast, and in the next moment he pierces the heart, and death is instantaneous." So, the only thing the prisoner suffers, in Morrison's account, is having the skin from his own eyebrows pulled down over his face so he can't see. Anyway, Morrison continues. Then he cuts the body into pieces, and the degradation consists in the fragmentary shape in which the prisoner has to appear in heaven. So, whether or not the victim is alive for the most gruesome bit seems to be almost a secondary issue. It's the spiritual horror that really brings this all to life for the victims. But again, Lingchi changes depending on the circumstances, and there's no guarantee your mortal existence would end with any mercy shown. One particularly grim case was that of a eunuch named Liu Jun, who was accused of conspiring against the interests of the emperor in the 16th century. For his betrayal, he was sentenced to death by Lingchi, and his executioners pulled no punches. His death was reported to have lasted 3 days, and he endured a total of 3,300 separate cuts and incisions before finally succumbing on the stake, completely unrecognizable as his limbs, skin, flesh, and face had been methodically sliced off from his body, one single piece at a time. It's said that the local people harboured such a hatred towards Liu Jun that when the execution was completed, they started bartering with the executioner, offering money in exchange for small strips of flesh, which they then ate with wine in order to further destroy his remains and express their anger at his betrayal of their emperor. All of this leads us to the story that inspired me to make this video in the first place, an event known as the Palace Plot of Renyin Year. Now, every time I do a video on China, I have to take a second aside to say that Chinese history goes exceptionally hard, and this story is no exception, so bear with me, it's worth it. It forever vindicates the immortal line that hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. And yes, it ends in Lingchi. Lots and lots of Lingchi. So, the story begins in the year 1542 with 4 people taking centre stage. First, you've got the Emperor Yaozhai and his primary wife, Empress Fang. Then, you've got 2 of the Emperor's concubines, Duan and Ning. Now, Emperor Yaozhai can share a bed with any of these women, but he's particularly fond of Duan, and as a result, both his wife Fang and his other concubine Ning start to get pretty jealous. It gets weirder though because Yaozhai happens to also be an aspiring alchemist, and he believes that a concoction called red lead will help him live to an unnaturally long age. The problem is that the primary ingredient in this elixir is the menstrual blood of young women. So, in order to keep the supply of red lead, he collects a harem of young girls around 13 to 14 years old and has them restricted to a diet of just mulberry leaves and rainwater. Anything else, and the elixir won't do its job. This predictably makes the girls really quite unwell, and before long they get sick of the diet and fed up of being used as human cattle for this depraved resource. So we've got a bunch of young girls desperate to escape their torment and personally angry with their emperor. Now, around this time, Emperor Yaozhai and his concubine Ning start to have a bit of a fallout, and as a result, Ning starts going around the palace saying that Yaozhai has lost the mandate of heaven and become bewitched by his favourite consort Duan, who is in fact not a woman, but a fox spirit sent to enchant the emperor. This might sound like a bit of a lover's tiff, but telling people that Yao Zhai had lost the mandate of heaven meant that he no longer had divine authority to rule. She was literally telling people he wasn't fit to be emperor and it was okay to dethrone him. Very naughty. But Yao Zhai keeps it cool and basically puts Ning on the naughty step by forcing her to go and cool off by hanging around with the harem of girls he was using to collect blood for his red lead potion. However, Ning does the opposite of cool down and instead she capitalizes on the hatred that these young girls have for the emperor and talks them into a plot to murder him. So, one night when the emperor was hanging out with his favourite consort, Duan, a group of these girls break into the chamber and overpower the emperor and start strangling him with a line of hemp. But the rope breaks before the job is done and all they've managed to do is strangle him until he passes out. At this stage, one of the girls, named Zhang Jinliang, sees all this going down, realizes what's happening, and then runs to the emperor's wife, Empress Fang, and tells her that her husband is under attack by the girls and that he needs help. Empress Fang then rocks up to the chamber, has all the girls arrested, and then has her husband taken to safety. Now, even though the girls didn't manage to kill the emperor, he was left basically comatose, which meant that Empress Fang had the responsibility of finding out who was guilty and what their punishment should be. But instead of going through all the work of figuring out who the ringleaders actually were and why they did it, she just stuck the whole thing in the too-hard bin and had them all executed, including Zhang Jinlian, the one who came to alert the Empress in the first place. But the plot thickens. See, the Empress didn't just kill all the girls who conspired against her husband, but she also saw an opportunity to get rid of her love rival, the Emperor's own favourite, Duan. And she did this on the basis that it happened in Duan's room, so Duan must have been guilty. All the girls involved were sentenced to death, and the method of execution was, predictably, Lingchi, and they had their remains hanged on meat hooks for all to see. 17 girls in total, nearly all under the age of adulthood, died in the most unspeakable way imaginable. But 3 days after all this, Emperor Yao Zhai wakes up from his coma, goes outside and sees the meat hooks with all the victims arranged across them, and when he finds out his favourite lover had been murdered over all of this, he never forgives his wife for her bloodlust, and her plan to keep her husband to herself by having his lover murdered backfires massively. So massively, in fact, that 5 years later, in 1547, a massive fire breaks out in the imperial palace, and when Emperor Yao Zhai escapes the flames, he tells his guards not to bother going back to save her, and to instead let her roast in the collapsing palace. She, predictably, was burned to death, and with that, all of the women in the story were now dead, leaving only the emperor standing, who would later claim that the death of his wife was all the will of heaven and had nothing to do with him or his actions. So, if you want to stay in one piece, never mix love with politics.